so welcome to our second July colloquium and the last one before the summer break. And I'm happy to see that so many people are interested here today. And Professor Dr. Lena Frischlich will discuss science in the firestorm of social media, research between reach, participation, and hate. Professor Frischlich will give science communication-oriented insights into the use, chances, and risk of science communication and reception in social media. Today in particular, she will examine the dynamics and consequences of hate speech and so-called firestorms. She's a communication scientist and media psychologist. She studied psychology at the University of Cologne and earned her doctorate there. In 2016, she led an interdisciplinary junior research on democratic resilience in Münster. And since April this year, she has held a professorship in Empirical Communication Studies at LMU. Welcome, Professor Frischlich.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I will now share my screen and hope that everyone can see everything. Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. As already introduced kindly by Paulina, I want to talk a bit more about science or science communication in the firestorm of social media and address particularly the dark side of science communication today. Why do I think that we need to talk about social media or digital communication in this context? As most of you will likely know or have learned over the course of this colloquium, digitization has substantially changed how we form our opinion about the world, how we inform ourselves. And when we look at the latest data from the Reuters Digital News Report for Germany, we see that since 2 or 3 years, even in Germany, the not so digitized part of Europe, people are now consuming more news via online sources, including social media, than via traditional linear media such as the television. And especially when we look at social media, we see that it's not the largest part of news consumption, but it's still more than traditional journalism. And especially for younger generations, social media has become a very relevant information source. For instance, 60% of those aged 18 to 24 have used Instagram last week to get their news across all the markets that are included in this survey. And this has led to some really disruptive changes to our public spheres. Not only do we live in a time of globally connected translocal publics, there's also a facilitated access to digitized publics. And within this digitized publics, often a convergence of so-called mass media communication channels like traditional journalist one-to-many communication and more interpersonal exchange. And this has led to some serious limitations in the authoritative control over information flows and a transition from a more gate-kept over a gate-watched and now a largely unedited public sphere. And this brings new opportunity structures. On the one hand, for participation and permanent connectedness, and I think we're all thankful that we didn't survive the pandemic in a time when there was only one telephone for the entire family. And of course, also global movements such as Fridays for Future are hard to imagine without this network global public spheres. So there are numerous opportunities to strengthen democracy and of course also for science communication. And people really want us to talk about our work. In an Ukrainian survey from 2021, the majority of those that have been questioned were interested in science communication. And yes, very often this is science communication related to health or medicine or more practical matters. But also the latest science barometer shows that people are really interested in us communicating our work. And as I already showed you how relevant social media has become in this realm, this also includes communication over social media. And when you look at the science barometer data, you see that people in the DACH region, so Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, think that scientists should communicate about their own results in the public sphere, but also about the results of other scientists that work on the same topic. And more than half believes that we should also talk about the societal consequences of our research. So there's a lot to gain within this new digital communication environment, but there are also some new opportunity structures for manipulation and norm transgressing dark participation, to stick with Thorsten Quann's Star Wars-inspired terminology. For instance, the spread of incivility, of cyberbullying, of hate speech, but also of mis- and disinformation and conspiracy theories. And what I want to do in the next 15 minutes is to show you why these concepts are also relevant for us as science communicators. But let me take a step back and explain a bit what I mean by this term. So incivility is something that is notoriously difficult to define, because it's a communication that violates communication norms, and norms are very context dependent. So what is incivil in one context might not be perceived as such in another. But there are two basic types of attacks or communication going against that can be perceived as being incivil. The one are attacks on individuals or their behavior, so types of impolite or offensive speech. And the other one are attacks on persons because of their social identities, for instance, their gender, their religious identity, or the larger groups they belong to. And this type of communication can also be described as intolerant or hate speech. And very often these attacks address those who are already marginalized in society. So when you imagine the wheel of power and privilege, the closer you are to the center, the more you are white, able-bodied, heterosexual, male, and speaking the language of the country where you live in, the less likely it is that you become a target of discrimination, and this includes intolerant speech. For instance, in Germany, 16% of women, but only 5% of men have been sexually harassed online, and 19% of LGBTQ people, as compared to heterosexuals, have been attacked personally. However, and that's the aspect I want to highlight today, there's also a form of hate speech or attacks on social identities towards those who have a certain set of societal power or have speaker roles that are associated with a larger reach. For instance, 73% of female reporters have been harassed, as data from the UNSCR shows for across the entire globe. And this can also include scientists. There was a recent Nature survey with 300 persons who spoke out about COVID-19 in the media, and very often also on social media. And this very small survey showed that more than half of them had received attacks on their credibility as a result of this form of science communication, and 21% had received threats of physical or sexual violence, and 15% had received death threats. Now you can say, okay, COVID was a very polarized topic, so maybe this is something that is exclusive to this kind of special situation, but that's not the case. We did a very small survey with the CHARMS network. It's a network that addresses or counters hate against researchers of media and communication studies. And what we did is that we asked communication scholars also in the DACH region, so Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, how their experiences are with hate speech. And we had 132 respondents, so not that many. We hope to gain more data in the future. But again, we see that the vast majority of them has observed hostilities against scientists in general, and also perceives that there's an increase in this kind of hateful attacks. And nearly 1 in 2 have been affected themselves, mainly by when communicating to the general public. So most of these attacks came from the general public, although there were also people who reported that they had been attacked by other scientists. And what's really important for science communication, also when we consider how much people want us to talk about our work, is that nearly half of our respondents did not speak out on political topics due to fear of hostility. And remember that most people would like us to talk about also the political implications of our work. Furthermore, these attacks can have several consequences beyond this silencing effect. bullying is associated with depression, and especially hate speech can trigger similar processes like other traumatic experiences. It additionally can threaten people's social identities. So in this case, for instance, their identity as a scientist, which can be a resource of well-being, but reduced so when it has been attacked. And also for those who observe this kind of attacks, hate speech contributes to desensitization, a loss of empathy, and reduced pro-social behavior towards those who have been attacked. So that's not something that we would want for empathic together in our society. But what do we know about the sources or the origins of this kind of uncivil communication? And I think it's really important to understand that hate speech and uncivil attacks, including attacks on scientists, can originate from very different sources. So on the most macro level, we have far-reaching, powerful communicators often doing or engaging in hate communication due to financial gains. For instance, populist politicians are more or less famous for their anti-science attitude. Think Donald Trump, for instance. But there are also an increasing number of, for instance, right-wing extremists or conspiracy ideologues that also attack scientists and their communication. For instance, during our meetings in the Charms Network, we had a guest who was part of a death threat list on Attila Hildmann's, with a German conspiracy ideologues. And there's also an increasingly large number of alternative counter media that offers space for pseudo-experts, but also attacks on scientific facts. On the more meso level, we have to look at coordinated group activity, which can be paid, considered troll armies, but which can also emerge more naturally from norm adaptation. And I think that one model that is really helpful in this context is the model of morally motivated harassment by Alice Marwick, which is also very closely related or inspired by other research on online firestorms. And the idea is that someone, for instance, a scientist, but also another person, says something or does something that is then declared by an influential speaker as being morally wrong. And because that influential speaker, for instance, a blogger or a far-right journalist, has a large follower group, these people want to behave morally themselves, but also show that they fit to the group identity, that they condemn morally wrong behavior. So what happens is that they start attacking and harassing the person who is perceived to have been acted in an immoral way. Beyond these more macro and meso level phenomena, we also have evidence that people have interindividual tendencies to engage in hateful communication. For instance, people with a certain personality, so a larger share in traits that have been described as the dark tetrad, psychopathy, Machiavellism, or sadism, so traits that are associated with a lack of empathy, are predictive or associated with a larger tendency to engage in hateful communication. Then there are also people who simply believe that there are that there is a certain set of social dominance in the society. So some groups are better than others. And there are also initial hints for ideological asymmetries. So especially hateful attacks are more often observed on the right-wing side of the political spectrum compared to the left-wing side. It doesn't mean that there's no left-wing hate, but it's a bit more frequent on the right-wing side. And one reason for that could be that people with more right-wing or conservative attitudes have a different set of moral intuitions as compared to people with more progressive values. And two moral intuitions are particularly relevant in that context. The one is loyalty and purity, which is typically valued highly by people with a more conservative worldview, compared to fairness and care, which are moral intuitions which are more closely related to progressive mindsets. And when you imagine that hate speech is often directed toward marginalized members of society, then it makes sense that those who value loyalty higher especially in-group loyalty higher, are less sensitive to these kinds of attacks as compared to those for whom care and fairness are very central values. And last but not least, hate speech can also be a hot reaction, so informed by current emotional states. For instance, the hate towards powerful figures, and I think that's something that is particularly relevant when we talk about journalism and science being the targets of attacks, but also motivated by threat perceptions, by anxiety. And I think especially this later link explains why the spread of science-related mis- and disinformation or conspiracy theories could be one motivator for the rise of these hostile attacks. These are two examples from a Sky News story about green conspiracy theories. And the one is a really threatful, apocalyptic example, saying you are the carbon that they want to reduce, so indicating that people should be eliminated for reducing their climate impact. And on the other side, something that has been, I think, also very viral in Germany in the last time, the idea that progressing towards a more climate-friendly economy would mean that there would be no vehicles, no meat, no oil, and no economy in the future. So here we have this more economical threat in there. Both are examples of larger mis- and disinformation spectrum, whereby misinformation usually describes misleading and unintentionally false information. And then we have this entire spectrum that also includes adding or omitting stuff or sloppy coverage, and ranges to really fabricated intentional disinformation. And just to make that sure, although I'm talking about attacks on scientists, bad science communication itself can also contribute to a chaos of information online. Consider, for instance, the Twitter account Just in Mice, who takes sensational headlines like this one, this popular anti-aging goo can help regrow muscles, and simply adds that this study has been conducted in mice and that it might not be a good idea to take in muscular stem cells yourself. But of course, there's also a large, really coordinated group of disinformation, especially when we talk about climate change, such as the European Institute for Climate and Energy, which publishes intentionally fabricated information to cover the dangers of climate change and to spread disinformation in this context. And what makes it so complicated is that this type of disinformation can relate to the core information, which can be a lie, but also to meta information such as misleading headlines or the context in which information is embedded. And on the core level, we often see typical tactics of science denial and misinformation, which includes the citing or quoting of fake experts. And if you don't know the Cranky Uncle blog, I highly recommend to study it, because you learn a lot about this communicative techniques here. The idea that someone who has a bachelor in computer science could also be an expert for surgeries. Other techniques include logical fallacies, such as the idea that it's cold, so climate change cannot exist, or impossible expectations regarding the preciseness of science. Here, someone who falls to the ground and is unhappy that it might take 12 to 15 seconds. And one central aspect here also is the spreading of conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are, I think, a term that has been widely popular in the last month. But just to take a step back, a conspiracy in the most simple form is a secret strategic collaboration of a powerful group of more than two people that act for their own good, and they lack solidarity or even endanger the larger public good. And a theory about a conspiracy is first and foremost an explanation of current historical or future events by such a conspiracy. And what I think is really important is that theories about conspiracies are not per se wrong. So powerful people do bad things on Earth. However, Even though conspiracy do happen once in a while, we usually mean conspiracy myth when we talk about conspiracy theories. And they have three additional aspects. The first is that they believe in an unrealistic power, especially for keeping secrets. There are very nice models from physics who show how unrealistic it is that a large group of people never talks about secret information, consider not even when they're drunk. Furthermore, and that can be very frustrating for science communicators, these type of conspiracy myths are usually not falsifiable. So when you present counter evidence, it's just taken for granted that there's an even larger conspiracy behind it. And they are characterized by a Manichaean worldview. So the idea that the other side is incorrigibly wicked, pervert, and dangerous, and that there is an apocalyptic fight of the good people against the bad ones. And that's where the how shall I say, the connection to hate speech is, and also the really problematic stuff lies. So why do people believe, especially in science conspiracy theories? From a more psychological point of view, believing in conspiracy theories is driven by human cognition, our ability to detect patterns in our social environments, our ability to detect goal-oriented behavior in other people, and also our ability to detect which people belong to which social groups, and our necessity to handle threats, especially when they come from powerful people, because that's evolutionarily quite difficult and dangerous. More broadly spoken, conspiracy theories satisfy epistemic needs, so they provide a coherent explanation, especially of big events, and thereby promise to reduce uncertainty. They satisfy existential needs because they give us a symbolic control about the world, because if Bill Gates is the cause for the COVID-19 pandemic, then there's a chance that we can prevent future pandemics by erasing that threat. They also give us a sense of meaningfulness, and very often they also satisfy social motives, such as our need for uniqueness. So we are the ones who understood it and all others are dumber than us. And often they also promise at least a community of fellow believers. And why is that so complicated, especially for science? So first of all, science is super complex and very seldom the final truth that we would like to have, or the certainty that we would like to have in the world. Science is furthermore done by people, so people can err. There is no perfect control in something that is done by people. And first and last but not least, there is the idea by Rutjens and Wekalov that people might be bad in distinguishing between science and the policy implications of science. So they might kind of mix up the idea that there is climate change and what kind of political policies are deducted from that information. So why is that a problem for us as as communicators, or also as people in a democratic stage? First of all, consuming conspiracy theories can diminish the trust in societal institutions. And although I don't know whether there's a study about it, this surely includes also scientific institutions. And conspiracy beliefs are associated with an increased intention for norm-deviant participation and a decreased intention for normative participation. So to put it bluntly, people are more willing to accept violence and less willing to go voting, which is bad. Furthermore, people who believe in conspiracy theories are also less likely to engage in evidence-based measures for either climate protection or, for instance, pandemic control measures. So how do we make science communication more resilient against hate and conspiracy myth? I have some initial suggestions to kick off our discussion. And I think that we need a whole of society approach. On the most macro level, we need to retain and restore trust. That is, we as science communicators have to transmit the idea that we want the best for people and the country or the world. We have to be integral in the stuff that we do, and we should be competent. We should not act as pseudo experts ourselves. And we have to stick to these rules, because reputation, which is the fourth pillar of trust, is something that has to be earned over time. We also, more on a societal level, should address the root causes of conspiracy beliefs, for instance, distrust and polarization, but that's beyond what we as scientists can do. On the more meso level, we need a more institutionalized support for scientists that have come under attack, and there's now a new hotline or website, a Safe Science. So if you have made such experiences, they can help you. You can also contact the Charms Network if you want to hang out and talk about these experiences. And overall, it is good if institutions have a plan how to protect their members and have a team that can support their members. Overall, we as scientists should support each other in these conditions. On the most micro level, so what can we as individuals do? We should put safety first and also have a plan. So consider that this is a realistic threat, that we take care of our own being trustworthiness, but also, and I think that's a very important point, because now I focused very much on the dark side, there's no reason to panic, because although there are all these things out there, and as you have seen, the numbers are not that small, if you have a good plan, if you have a good team, there is the good reason to be confident that your science communication overall creates so much net positive also for yourself that there's no reason to panic. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.